And what's interesting about Maimonides' Ladder, and if people don't know it, Maimonides, who was a great Jewish thinker, and has written many law codes, and he wrote in a piece about different levels of what tzedakah, what charity would be, from what the lowest rung to the highest rung. Although I think he actually starts from the top down to the bottom, and really emphasizes a lot of the anonymity and how valuable that is. That in many ways, the more anonymous you are, the better a person you are, and yet we as individuals, we want to reap the benefit, as you say, of, oh wow, look at how generous I am. So I'm curious as to, did you start by saying, oh, we want to look at Maimonides' Ladder to be able to see, is this true, or was it more, boy, this is actually a baked in methodology that we can explore and use that to untangle some of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a little bit of both. I mean, I think that we had already been thinking that knowledge states and anonymity were sort of really deep factors in ascriptions of charitability. And then we sort of, came upon Maimonides' Ladder, and it all sort of clicked together. Not only was he talking about knowledge states, but he sort of already had, in some sense, a set of experimental manipulations laid out so beautifully for us to, capitalize on. So I think it was the two things sort of coming together really nicely.
And if I remember that in your paper, you don't look at all 8 rungs. You selected a few of them. And was that more of a methodological consideration to say, look, we can't do all 8, and we can't do a double-blind control study of helping somebody get out of poverty? It sounds like, if I remember, you selected 4 of the rungs, if I remember.
Yeah, so we don't look at the very first rung, which is, as you point out, to allow someone to escape poverty altogether. The reason we focus mostly on the next 4 rungs is because they have to do with mental states and creating different kinds of mutual knowledge, which fit most with theories of direct reciprocity. Now, in one of our later experiments, we do also look a little bit at rungs 7 and 8, which have to do, as you would know, with whether someone gives grudgingly, whether they're willing to give or not. And in those studies, we look at this idea that aside from whether someone is giving anonymously, which could tell you about whether they're interested in reciprocity, are people also sensitive to this idea that when someone gives, they're also potentially signaling that they're truly interested in engaging in a social relationship that will sort of persist past this first exchange? And also, do they see themselves as being sort of on an equal footing with the beneficiary, or do they see themselves as being sort of in a more of a dominance relationship where they're sort of flouting their status? So those experiments get more at those last 2 considerations. But yes, for the most part, we focus on the rungs 2 to 6, which concern knowledge states.
And I'm curious as to, what did you find in the paper? What were some of the results that you discovered?
Yeah. So, one thing that immediately struck us was that when we looked at people's descriptions of charitability, they cohered really nicely with Maimonides' Ladder up until the point where we looked at the difference between a donor who merely shares his or her identity compared to a donor who both shares his identity and finds out the identity of the beneficiary. So on Maimonides' Ladder and on the predictions that we initially had, we expected that last level in which both identities are known, that would be sort of seen as the least charitable of all, because in that situation, the donor can really guarantee that he'll be reciprocated, because both parties know what's just happened, and not only that, the donor can definitely receive reputational benefits, say if the beneficiary told someone else. But nonetheless, it was just that last level that didn't fit the pattern. So what we found was that actually, if you just look at what people think in terms of the motives for reciprocity on the part of the donor, then those fit Maimonides' ladder perfectly. So, you know, even for these last two levels, people do think that if you create a situation where both parties know each other's identity, that you're probably interested in reciprocity. But then what we found is that in addition to that, people do not only care about reciprocity, but also a little what I was telling you about, where they think that a donor who exchanges photos, you know, one who sort of puts himself out there, is also potentially interested in engaging in a long-lasting communal relationship, and also sees himself as sort of being equal in status to the beneficiary. So we think that these additional sort of considerations might offset the initial sort of negative impression you might get that the donor is, you know, solely interested in reciprocity.